James, a millionaire man, decided to put his family to the test. He disguised himself as a beggar and knocked on the door of his own mansion. But what he saw left him destroyed. His brother shouted at him with contempt, his wife laughed at his appearance, and his 14-year-old daughter only closed the curtain and disappeared, as if he did not exist. Kneeling on the cold street under the rain that wet his face, James cried, not for himself, but for discovering that in his own house, compassion had died. But what he did next changed everything forever. Like this, if this touched your soul, it is more than a click. It is a silent hug between those of us who know how much indifference hurts. Comment how you think this story is going to end. Will he take revenge? Will he forgive them? We want to read you. And if you have not subscribed yet, it costs you nothing. But for us it means the world. Thank you for being here. Night fell over New York like a dark velvet blanket, and in the streets of the Upper East Side, the streetlights cast golden circles on the newly washed pavement. James Miller walked slowly toward his own house, but his steps were no longer those of a businessman used to conquering boardrooms and signing millionaire contracts. He had been preparing for 6 months for this moment. 6 months investigating, observing, learning to disappear inside his own skin. The fake beard itched against his chin. The clothes he had bought at a flea market smelled of mothballs and accumulated humidity. He had practiced in front of the mirror a hunched posture, as if life had broken his spine, and he had rehearsed a hoarse, scratchy voice, the voice of someone who has screamed too much or who has stopped talking because no one listens. The professional makeup artist he hired, discreetly paying him triple to guarantee silence, had worked for 3 hours that afternoon, creating deep, dark circles, spots on the skin, fake wrinkles that looked like scars of time. James stopped half a block from the mansion. From there he could see the illuminated windows, the perfectly kept garden, the white columns that flanked the entrance like guardians of a castle. He had built all of that. Every stone, every window, every square foot of that palace had been paid for, with sleepless nights, with difficult decisions, with the sweat of someone who grew up in a neighborhood where luxury was having food every day. He breathed deep. The cold November air filled his lungs and brought him the scent of dry leaves accumulated on the sidewalks. For an instant he considered turning back, returning to the hotel, taking off the disguise, forgetting all this. But then he remembered the conversations he had heard in the last months. Vanessa complaining because the chef had prepared salmon instead of sea bass. Arthur bragging to his friends about the mansion where he lives. Madison asking for another phone because hers was already 6 months old. No one talked about effort. No one thanked. No one seemed to remember that all of that had not always been there. James clenched his fists inside the torn pockets of the coat and kept walking. When he reached the forged iron gate, a gate that he himself had designed, choosing every decorative detail, he pressed the intercom button with a trembling finger. Not out of fear of rejection, out of fear of being right. The intercom creaked with static electricity. "Who is it?" Arthur's voice sounded impatient, annoyed, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of something important. James cleared his throat, adjusted his voice to the rehearsed register. "Good night. Excuse the bother. I only need a little water if it were possible." There was a pause. James imagined his younger brother frowning, looking at the security screen that showed the grainy image of a dirty old man at the door. "How did you get here?" The irritation in Arthur's voice intensified. "This is a private area." "Just a glass of water, sir. I have been walking all day. This is not a soup kitchen." Arthur cut the connection. James waited. He counted to 30. He knew that the new cameras he had ordered installed 3 weeks ago, supposedly to improve security, were recording every second. He pressed the button again. "Please, just a little water." This time the answer was the sound of hurried steps on gravel. The side garden door opened with a metallic squeak, and Arthur appeared, dressed in a cashmere sweater and linen pants. At 42 years old, Arthur Miller had developed a permanent expression of superiority that was not sustained by any achievement of his own. Everything he had, the German car, the apartment downtown, the vacations in the Caribbean, he had gotten with James's money, with loans that were never returned and bills that always ended up being paid in the family. "Are you deaf or what?" Arthur approached the gate without opening it, looking at James as if he were an insect. "We don't give handouts here. Leave before I call the police. Just a glass of water." James kept his voice submissive, his gaze low. "I don't want to bother—" "Well, you are already bothering." Arthur made a gesture toward the two security guards who were approaching from the booth. "I don't want to see you near this house again. Do you understand? People like you bring problems, bring dirt." The words fell like stones. James felt something break inside his chest, but he kept his composure. The guards, men he himself had hired 2 years ago, who received generous salaries and Christmas bonuses, stood at each side of Arthur with neutral expressions. "Get him out of here," Arthur ordered with a contemptuous gesture of his hand. "And if he comes back, call the police." Then she appeared. Vanessa came out of the house as if she were on a catwalk, in an emerald green silk dress that James had bought her in Paris the year before. She had her hair pulled back in an elegant bun and a necklace of authentic pearls at her neck. At 45 years old, she was still beautiful, but there was something in her beauty that had become cold, like a perfect marble statue, but without life. "What is happening here?" Vanessa approached with a glass of red wine in her hand, her heels clicking on the tiles of the path. "A beggar bothering," Arthur explained. "I'm handling it." Vanessa stopped several feet from the gate and squinted her eyes to observe James. For a second that seemed eternal, their gazes met. James thought that maybe, perhaps, something in her would recognize not his face, but his essence. The way he had looked at her during 19 years of marriage, the way he had taken care of her when she got sick, the nights they had dreamed together of building a happy family. But Vanessa only wrinkled her nose. "My God, it smells from here." She laughed, a brief and cutting laugh. "How did he get to this area? I thought the city had cleaned the streets." The words did not sound like a deliberate insult. They sounded worse, like a casual observation, as if James were an object out of place, a wrong piece of furniture in a perfect room. "He is leaving, honey," Arthur said in a complacent tone. "Don't worry." Vanessa drank a sip of wine, turned around and started to walk away. But then, in one of the windows of the second floor, a young face appeared. Madison. James felt his heart stop. His daughter. His little Madison, who was now 14 years old and had stopped being a girl without him noticing. She was at the window of her room, looking down with wide eyes. James saw her hesitate, saw how her hand rose as if she were going to open the window, as if she were going to shout something. "Please," James thought, "please, daughter, say something, do something." But then he heard Vanessa's voice from inside the house. "Madison, what are you doing standing there? Come finish dinner." The girl looked back toward the interior of her room. When she looked back at the window, her expression had changed. There was in her eyes something like resignation, or perhaps fear of contradicting her mother. Slowly, without saying a word, Madison closed the curtain. And so, in less than 5 minutes, James Miller ceased to exist for his own family. The guards opened the gate only enough to exit. They grabbed James by the arms with more force than necessary and dragged him several feet down the street. One of them, the youngest, pushed him roughly and James fell to his knees on the cold asphalt. "Don't come back here, old man," the guard said. "Next time we won't be so kind." James stayed there kneeling while he heard them walk away. The gate closed with a final metallic sound. The lights of the mansion shone warm and cozy behind the forged iron bars. From where he was, he could see Vanessa's silhouette moving through the living room, Arthur pouring another glass of wine, life continuing as if nothing had happened. He stood up slowly. His knees hurt, but it was a physical pain, manageable. The other pain, that other pain had no name. He walked slowly through the empty streets of the neighborhood, moving away from the mansion without looking back. Each step echoed in the silence of the night. He passed in front of other illuminated houses, other perfect gardens, other families dining behind bright windows. And for the first time in 48 years, James Miller understood what it meant to be invisible. The Ritz Hotel was only 20 minutes by taxi, but James walked almost an hour before stopping at a corner and calling a car. He needed the time. He needed the cold air hitting his face. He needed to process what he had just witnessed. When he finally entered the suite he had reserved under a false name, he stood in the middle of the room for several minutes, still with the disguise on. The bathroom mirror reflected a man he did not recognize, hunched, dirty, forgettable. He took off the ragged coat and let it fall to the floor. Then the fake beard, the makeup spots, the thermal underwear that gave him the appearance of more thinness. Each layer he removed was like taking off a dead skin. He opened the shower and let the hot water run for long minutes before stepping under the stream. The water washed away the makeup, the faked dirt, the smell of mothballs. But it did not take away the memory of Arthur's voice saying, "People like you." It did not take away Vanessa's cold laugh. It did not erase the image of Madison closing the curtain. James stayed under the water until it turned cold, until his fingers wrinkled, until he could no longer distinguish if what was running down his face was water or tears. When he came out, he wrapped himself in a hotel robe and sat in front of the vanity mirror. There he was, James Miller, successful businessman, millionaire, discreet philanthropist. Angular face, well-cut grey hair, brown eyes that had learned to read financial balances and negotiate international contracts. But that night, looking at himself in the mirror, he saw another man. He saw the 9-year-old boy who delivered newspapers at 5 in the morning before going to school. He saw the teenager who studied under the streetlights because in his house there was only one light bulb and his brothers needed to do homework too. He saw the 22-year-old young man who worked as a warehouse assistant while taking business administration at Night University, sleeping 4 hours a night for 5 years. His mother, Rose, had been a washerwoman. She washed other people's clothes in a metal tub until her hands cracked and bled. His father, Michael, drove public buses during 12-hour shifts, returning home with a broken back and swollen feet. There were never vacations. There were never luxuries. But there was dignity. There was love. There was a lesson that Rose repeated every night before sleeping. Money comes and goes, Jim, but what you are inside, no one can take that from you. James closed his eyes. His mother had died 10 years ago, when he had already made his first fortune. He settled her in a comfortable house, paid for private nurses, gave her everything she never had. But Rose never stopped being humble. She kept washing her own clothes. She kept cooking for the neighbors. She kept treating the gardener and the cleaning girl as if they were family. "It doesn't matter how much you have," she told James. "It matters how you treat those who can give you nothing in return." Vanessa never understood that. When James met her, she worked as a public relations officer in an events company. She was smart, ambitious, beautiful, and he fell in love sincerely. The first years were good. Madison was born and brought joy. But little by little, as James's fortune grew, Vanessa was changing. Or perhaps she had always been like that and he had not wanted to see it. The jewels became larger, the cars more expensive, the friends more superficial. And when James tried to talk about donating more money to social causes, Vanessa would roll her eyes. "You already do enough," she would say. "You can't save the whole world." But it was not about saving the world. It was about remembering where things came from, about honoring effort, about not forgetting that fortune is fragile and humanity is the only thing that remains. James opened the laptop and accessed the security system of the mansion. The cameras had recorded everything in high definition. He played the videos once, then another, and another. Each viewing was like driving a knife deeper into his chest, but he needed to see it. He needed to be sure. There were no doubts. There was no ambiguity. The way Arthur had looked at him was not simply contempt toward a stranger. It was casual cruelty, the type of cruelty that is born from feeling superior without having earned it. Vanessa's laugh was even worse because it was empty of conscious malice. She simply did not care. And Madison, his little Madison, had had the chance to choose and chose silence. At 3 in the morning, James finally went to bed, but he did not sleep. He stayed looking at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the hotel room, thinking about decisions and consequences. He did not want revenge. Revenge was easy, Fast, empty. He could divorce Vanessa tomorrow and leave her with the minimum the law required. He could cut all financial support to Arthur and see him sink in the debts he had accumulated. He could send Madison to a boarding school and forget the family he had built. But that would change nothing. It would teach them nothing. It would only confirm what they already believed, that money is the only thing that matters. No, if he was going to do this, he would do it right. He would give them a real chance to change, a chance they perhaps did not deserve, but that he, out of respect for his mother's memory, would offer them anyway. When the dawn started to paint the sky pink, James had already made a decision. James spent all Sunday locked in the hotel suite, making phone calls and sending encrypted messages. At 9 in the morning, he spoke with his lead lawyer, Frank Reed, a 60-year-old man who had been working for him for 20 years and knew every detail of his financial empire. "Frank, I need you to prepare divorce documents. Complete. But do not file them yet." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, James?" "I have never been more sure of anything." The next call was to Daniel, his oldest son. Daniel was 28 years old and had been born from a relationship James had before meeting Vanessa. Daniel's mother had died in a traffic accident when the boy was only 3 years old, and James had raised him alone for several years before marrying. Daniel grew up watching his father build an empire from zero. He worked summers in the company warehouse. He studied industrial engineering, paying part of the university, with scholarships he won by his own merit. Now he was operations manager in one of the factories and lived in a modest apartment in the outskirts of the city, even though James had offered 1,000 times to help him with something better. "Dad, what's happening?" Daniel sounded worried. "I thought you were in Chicago." "I'm in the city. I need you to come to the hotel. We have to talk." "Are you okay?" "Come, son. Bring your laptop." Daniel arrived an hour later in jeans and a simple shirt, his hair still wet from the shower. He looked like James, same square chin, same direct gaze. But there was something in Daniel that James valued more than any physical resemblance. There was integrity in every gesture, honesty in every word. James showed him the videos. Daniel watched them in silence, his face becoming increasingly pale. When they finished, he stayed looking at the turned-off screen for a long time. "My God," he murmured finally. "Dad, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I just need you to be present tomorrow, as a witness." "What are you going to do?" James explained the plan. Daniel listened without interrupting, nodding from time to time. At the end, his son looked at him with something like respect and sadness mixed. "Do you think they will change?" Daniel asked in a low voice. "I don't know. But I need to give them the chance. If I don't, I will be as hard as them." Daniel hugged his father. A long, firm hug, one of those that say more than 1,000 words. Monday morning, James sent a message to Vanessa and Arthur, summoning them to an urgent meeting at the central offices of Miller Enterprises. Subject: important family decisions, mandatory attendance, 11 a.m. Vanessa responded with a question mark emoji. Arthur asked if it had to do with investments. Neither seemed worried. At 10:30, James was already in the boardroom on the 12th floor. It was a room he had designed personally: solid oak table, Italian leather chairs, large windows overlooking the whole city. In those walls, million-dollar agreements had been closed. Contracts had been signed that changed whole industries, but never had such a personal battle been fought. Frank arrived with a briefcase full of documents. Daniel sat in a corner, discreet but present. And at 11 sharp, Vanessa and Arthur entered as if they were going to any business meeting. Vanessa wore an ivory-colored Chanel suit and sunglasses. She did not take off until sitting down. Arthur wore a navy blue blazer that James had given him at Christmas. The two sat in front of James with expressions of curiosity mixed with impatience. "Jim, what is all this?" Vanessa looked around. "I thought you were in Chicago until Wednesday." "I changed plans," James said calmly. "Sit down properly. This is going to take a while." Arthur leaned back in the chair, crossing his legs. "Does it have to do with the project in Miami? Because I have an important lunch at 12:30. Cancel it, James interrupted. Something in his tone made Arthur close his mouth. Vanessa took off her glasses slowly, studying her husband's face. What's wrong, James? You are scaring me. James took the remote control for the giant screen mounted on the wall. He pressed a button. The screen turned on, showing the frozen image of the mansion gate at night, with a hunched figure in front of the camera. Before you see this, James said, I want you to know that what is going to happen in the next minutes will change everything. Forever. He pressed play. The silence in the boardroom was so thick it could be cut with a knife. On the screen, the scene unfolded with brutal clarity. Arthur shouting insults, Vanessa laughing with contempt, the guards dragging the old man, Madison closing the curtain. James observed their faces while they watched. Arthur turned pale first, then red, then pale again. Vanessa put a hand to her mouth, but did not look away from the screen. When the video ended, no one spoke for almost a full minute. Vanessa found her voice first, trembling. Is this some kind of joke? Did you record us without permission? The security cameras I installed 3 weeks ago, James responded with glacial calm. You signed the authorization. To protect the family, you said. Arthur stood up suddenly, making the chair screech against the floor. What the hell is this, James? Did you spy on us? Did you hire an actor to... There was no actor. James stood up slowly, planting his hands on the table. That beggar was me. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of the world stopping. Vanessa shook her head, as if rejecting the information. No, that is impossible. I would have recognized you. You didn't recognize me because you never really looked at me. James's voice was soft but cut like glass. You saw someone you considered without value and decided he didn't deserve even a glass of water. He didn't even deserve basic humanity. Arthur let himself fall into the chair, his face completely white. James, I didn't know. If I had known... Exactly. James pointed at him. If you had known it was me, you would have treated me different. But that is precisely the problem. The way you treat someone should not depend on who you think they are. It should depend on who you are. Vanessa stood up, trembling. This is not fair. You set a trap for us. You tricked us so that you would show who you really are. James walked around the table, approaching her. Yes, that is exactly what I did. And it worked. Vanessa took a step back, with tears starting to form in her eyes. And what did you expect? That we would open the door to any stranger? That we would invite every beggar who rings the bell to stay for dinner? I expected compassion, James responded simply. I expected you to at least give water to a thirsty old man. I expected my daughter not to close a curtain and pretend that a human being does not exist. The mention of Madison seemed to hit Vanessa harder than everything else. She put her hands to her face. Madison is not to blame. She is only a child. She is a child who is learning from you. James pointed to the screen. Look at her. She had the chance to do the right thing, and she chose to look away. Arthur finally found his voice, hoarse and broken. James, brother. All the money you lent me, I will pay it back. I swear that I don't want your promises, Arthur. James looked at him fixedly. I have heard them for 20 years. I'll pay you next month. This time it's different. I just need a little more time. Lies, all lies, and I allowed them because you are my brother, because I thought I was helping you. You were helping me. No, I was making you weak. I was teaching you that there would always be someone to save you from your mistakes, that you could live without consequences. Frank cleared his throat from his seat and spoke for the first time. Mr. Miller, do you want us to proceed with the documents? James breathed deep. This was the moment. The fork in the road. He could crush them right now. He could sign the divorce, cut all financial support to Arthur, establish a trust for Madison, but with restricted access until she was an adult. He could make them pay for every second of humiliation he had felt, kneeling on that cold street. But then he thought of his mother. He thought of the times she had given him second chances when he was young and stupid. He thought of how true forgiveness was not forgetting, but giving the chance to learn. "No," he said finally. "Not yet." Vanessa raised her head with red eyes. "What?" James returned to his seat and leaned back, studying the two in front of him. "I am going to give you a chance. Only one. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to be the type of man who destroys without offering redemption." He explained the conditions to them. Every word, every requirement, every deadline. Vanessa had to work a full day in a shelter for homeless people, without a driver, without privileges, just her and reality. Arthur had 6 months to return every dollar he had borrowed, working, selling the unnecessary, living with the essentials. And Madison had to do volunteer work every Saturday for 6 months, learning to see people for real. "If at the end of those 6 months I see a real, genuine change, then we will talk about rebuilding this family." James stood up. "But if you only pretend, if you do it out of obligation without learning anything, then the divorce papers will be signed, and each will go their own way." Vanessa was crying openly now. "James, please. You can't." "Yes, I can." He looked at her without anger, only with deep sadness. "And I'm going to do it. The decision is yours. You change for real, or we lose this forever." Arthur had his head between his hands. "And what if we try, but it's not enough for you? If we do everything and even then you decide that no, then at least you will have learned something." James picked up his documents. "And maybe that will serve you to be better people, even if it's not with me." He left them sitting there, destroyed and in silence. Daniel followed him to the elevator. When the doors closed, his son put a hand on his shoulder. "I am proud of you, Dad." James nodded, unable to speak, because he knew that the hardest part was just beginning. The St. Vincent shelter was in a busy neighborhood, in a 3-story building that had been an old convent. Vanessa arrived on a Wednesday morning in a taxi because James had forbidden her from using the driver. She wore jeans, the cheapest she had, which was still designer, and a simple white shirt. She had pulled her hair back in a ponytail and wore no jewelry, following the instructions to the letter. The director of the shelter, Sarah Thompson, a woman in her late 50s with grey hair and worker's hands, received her at the entrance. "You must be Vanessa." Sarah did not smile, but she was not hostile either. "James told me about the situation. Here we work for real. If you expected this to be easy, you were wrong." "I'm ready," Vanessa lied. The first 2 hours were in the kitchen. Vanessa, who had never washed a dish in her mansion, because there were maids for that, found herself scrubbing huge pots, cleaning tables, peeling pounds of potatoes for lunch. Her hands, used to expensive creams and weekly manicures, turned red and cracked. Her back ached from being bent over the sink. And every time she looked at the clock, only 10 minutes had passed. But the worst was not the physical work. The worst was the people. At 11, during the coffee break, Sarah took her to the dining room where the residents were starting to arrive. Vanessa stayed behind the service counter with a spoon in her hand, while people lined up with their trays. The first to arrive was a man of about 60, thin to the bones with clean but patched clothes in several places. "Good morning," the man said with a toothless smile. Vanessa served the soup in silence, avoiding eye contact. Then came a young woman. She couldn't be more than 25, with a baby strapped to her chest. "Is there milk for my boy?" she asked with a tired voice. Sarah appeared at Vanessa's side with a bottle. "Of course there is, Lucy. How is David today?" The conversation continued, warm and familiar, while Vanessa stood there feeling completely out of place. At noon, when the dining room was full and noisy, Sarah signaled Vanessa to sit at one of the tables. "Here we all eat together," she explained. "Volunteers, residents, everyone equal." Vanessa sat at a table where there were already 3 people: an older man who introduced himself as Anthony, a middle-aged woman named Carmen, and a young man about 20 who said his name was Ray. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Vanessa picked at the food, feeling observed, judged. Then Carmen spoke. "First time here?" Vanessa nodded. "It shows." Carmen smiled, but there was no malice in the comment. "Don't worry, you get used to it." "Do you live here?" Vanessa asked, and immediately regretted how the question sounded. But Carmen did not seem offended. For 3 months. Before, I worked as a seamstress in a textile factory. 45 years in the same position. When they closed, I couldn't pay the rent. She shrugged. One bad streak turns into another, and suddenly you are on the street. It's easier than people think. Vanessa felt something tightening in her chest. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, help. Carmen pointed to Vanessa's plate. And eat. The food here is good, although you're probably used to better. The rest of the day was a succession of exhausting tasks. Folding sheets in the laundry, organizing clothing donations in the warehouse, cleaning the bathrooms. Each task was simple but repetitive, and Vanessa felt how the tiredness accumulated in her muscles and in her mind. But what hit her most were the stories. She heard Anthony tell how he had lost his wife to cancer, and in his depression, lost also his job and his house. She heard Ray explain that he spent all his savings taking care of his sick mother until nothing was left. She heard Lucy talk about how the father of her baby abandoned her when she got pregnant, and her family kicked her out of the house. None of those people were what Vanessa had imagined. They were not lazy. They were not stupid. They were not dangerous. They were human beings who had had bad luck and had fallen through the cracks of a system that did not catch them. When the day ended and Vanessa left the shelter at 7 in the evening, the sun had already set. She stood on the sidewalk, exhausted to the bones, with rough hands and clothes smelling like bleach. She raised an arm to call a taxi, but before one stopped, she stopped. In her pocket, she had a card that Sarah had given her at the end of the day. If you want to come back as a real volunteer, not because you have to, call me. We always need people who really care. Vanessa looked at the card for a long moment. Then she put it in her pocket and got into the taxi, without being sure of who she was anymore. Arthur sat in front of the computer in his apartment at 2 in the morning, with a notebook full of numbers that made him feel physically sick. He had spent the last 3 weeks doing something he had never done before, an honest accounting of his life. Every loan James had given him, every temporary help, every bill paid just for this time, every credit card debt his brother had assumed without questions. The total was devastating. $240,000. Arthur had told himself for years that it was not that much, that James had millions, that what did it matter, that it was family and families help each other. But now, looking at that number written in his own handwriting, he understood the magnitude of what he had done. It had not been help, it had been abuse. The first decision was the most painful. He sold the Mercedes he had bought 2 years ago with a loan from James. A used car dealership offered him $42,000. Arthur accepted without negotiating. Then he sold the Rolex watch, $6,000. The wine collection he had been accumulating, $4,000. The designer suits he had barely used, $3,000. In total, he recovered $55,000. $185,000 were missing. Arthur looked for a job, not a management job, not comfortable positions with important titles. Real work. He responded to ads for salesmen, for commercial representatives, for anything that paid commissions. And to his surprise, he got a position selling auto insurance. The first day was humiliating. His supervisor was a 26-year-old kid who explained the sales techniques to him as if Arthur were a clumsy student. His colleagues were people who worked for real, who had sales goals and families to feed. And Arthur, who had never had to meet quotas in his life, discovered he was terrible at selling. During the first 2 weeks, he sold nothing. 0. Customers hung up the phone on him. Home visits ended with closed doors. And every night he returned to his apartment feeling smaller than ever. But in the 3rd week, something changed. Arthur was visiting an older couple in a modest neighborhood. He was explaining the insurance options when the lady interrupted. "Pardon me, but you seem new at this." Arthur blushed. "It's very obvious, right?" "Quite," the man smiled. "But at least you are honest. That counts." For the first time, Arthur did not try to pretend. He told them the truth, that he was learning, that he needed the job, that he would do everything possible to give them the best service. And to his surprise, they signed. It was a small sale, with a minimum commission. But Arthur felt more proud of those $200 than of anything James had given him. On the weekends, he started doing something more. He showed up at the St. Vincent shelter and offered help. Not because James had asked him to, because he needed to prove something to himself. He repaired a broken fence in the yard. He painted the dining room walls. He fixed leaky pipes. Manual physical work that left him exhausted and sweaty. But there was dignity in that tiredness. It was the honest tiredness of someone who contributes. One afternoon, while he was sanding a door, Sarah approached with 2 coffees. "Your brother told me what happened," she said, offering him a cup. Arthur stopped sanding. "And what do you think?" "I think you did something terrible." Sarah drank her coffee. "But I also think you are here, and that means something." Arthur nodded in silence, unable to look her in the eyes. "I don't know if I can return all the money to him in 6 months," he admitted. "It's too much." "Maybe it's not just about the money." Sarah pointed to the door he was repairing. "Maybe it's about proving that you are capable of something more than just receiving." Those words stayed with Arthur. And that night, in his small and empty apartment, he promised himself something. No matter how long it took, he would return every dollar. Not out of fear, but because he finally understood what it meant to earn things. Madison arrived at the shelter the first Saturday with her arms crossed and an expression of absolute resentment. She was 14 years old and convinced that all this was deeply unfair. She had done nothing wrong. She had not insulted anyone. She had only closed a curtain. Sarah put her to work in the living room, where the children who lived temporarily in the shelter spent the afternoons. There were 7 children between 5 and 12 years old, all with stories that Madison did not know and did not want to know. "Read for them," Sarah told her, pointing to a box of donated books. 1 hour. Madison sat in a chair, surrounded by children who looked at her with expectation. She chose the shortest book she could find, a story about a rabbit, and started reading in a monotone voice, without emotion. The children got bored in 5 minutes. One started making drawings. Another yawned. A little girl left. Sarah appeared at the door and shook her head. "If you are going to read, do it well. They deserve your best effort." Madison felt something strange. Shame. The second Saturday was different. She arrived with a book she had bought herself, one she liked for real, an adventure story about a girl who traveled the world. And this time, when she read, she put emotion into the characters' voices. The children came closer. They listened. And when the chapter ended, a girl about 10 years old named Nora approached shyly. "Are you coming back next Saturday?" "Yes," Madison responded, surprising herself. "Can you bring more books?" Madison looked at Nora, clean but patched clothes, shoes too big, eyes bright with intelligence, and she felt something she didn't expect, connection. "Do you like books?" Nora nodded with enthusiasm. "I love to read, but here there are almost no books for children, and in my old house." She stopped, looking at the floor. Madison understood without Nora having to explain. That week, Madison did something she had never done. She organized a campaign in her school. She put up posters asking for donations of children's books. She spoke in the school assembly. She convinced her classmates to bring books they no longer used. In 2 weeks, she had collected more than 200 books. The following Saturday, she arrived at the shelter with her father in a taxi, the trunk full of boxes. Sarah helped her bring everything up to the living room, and together they organized the books on makeshift shelves. "We are going to make a library," Madison announced to the children. "A library just for you." Nora hugged her with so much force she almost knocked her down. And Madison, for the first time in months, felt she had done something that mattered for real. That night at home, she found her father in the study. "Dad," she began with her voice trembling, "about what happened. About the night when—" James looked up from his documents. "Yes, Madison. I'm sorry." Tears started to fall. "I should have opened the window. I should have said something. But I was afraid and—" James stood up and hugged her. "I know, honey. And what you are doing now, that also counts. Do you really think I can change? You already are." Madison clung to her father, understanding for the first time the weight of her actions and the responsibility of correcting them. Vanessa returned to the shelter, not because she had to. She had already fulfilled the mandatory day, but because she could not stop thinking about Carmen, the 72-year-old former seamstress had stayed in her mind, with her resigned smile and her hands deformed by decades of work. Vanessa arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Sarah was not expecting her. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, surprised. "I want to talk with Carmen if she agrees." Carmen was in the yard, sewing a button on an old shirt. When she saw Vanessa, she raised her eyebrows. The rich lady returned. Vanessa sat at her side. "Can I ask you something?" "You can." How did you get here?" Carmen put down the needle and looked toward the sky, as if she were remembering. "I worked 45 years in the same textile factory. I never married. I never had children. Work was my life. When they closed, I was 68 years old. No one hires an old seamstress when they can get young people for less money." She paused. "I had savings, but not much. The rent went up. The bills accumulated. And one day the landlord kicked me out. Simple as that." "Didn't you have family?" "A nephew in Boston. I asked him for help. He told me he didn't have space." Carmen smiled with sadness. "I don't blame him. He has his own life." Vanessa felt a knot in her throat. I never thought someone like you could end up like this. You worked all your life. The system doesn't protect everyone equally." Carmen went back to sewing. "But I'm not bitter. I have a roof, food, and these fingers still serve for something." "What are you going to do?" "Sarah is trying to get me a social protection apartment. Meanwhile, I am here." She looked at Vanessa directly. "And you? What are you going to do?" The question took Vanessa by surprise. "I don't know what you mean." "You came here out of obligation. You saw things you didn't expect. Now you know stories like mine." Carmen pointed with the needle. "The question is, are you going to go back to your old life and forget all this? Or are you going to do something?" Vanessa did not answer immediately, but that night in the mansion she could not sleep. She stayed awake thinking about Carmen, about Ray, about Lucy and her baby, about all the people she had met and who were still fighting while she slept in silk sheets. The next morning she called James. "I need your help with something." Vanessa spent 3 months investigating, planning, consulting with experts. She spoke with social workers, with economists, with psychologists specialized in homeless people. And slowly, an idea started to take shape that at first seemed impossible, but that every day felt more necessary. She designed a complete labor reintegration program for people in risk situations. It was not just giving food or temporary housing. It was offering real training, professional certifications, psychological support, and the most important, connections with companies willing to give opportunities. She named it Dignity Project. But there was a problem. She needed initial capital. A lot. At least $300,000 to start with the first group of beneficiaries. Vanessa looked at the jewels in her safe. Necklaces that cost $20,000 and that she had used once. Diamond bracelets that shone at parties and then were forgotten. Earrings that were worth more than a person's annual salary. For a whole week, she hesitated. They were her things. James had given them to her. They were symbols of love, of success, of status. But then she remembered Carmen's smile when she sewed. She remembered Lucy carrying her baby with infinite tenderness, despite having nothing. She remembered Anthony talking about his dead wife with wet eyes, but without self-pity. And she understood that those jewels were not symbols of love. They were symbols of vanity. And true love does not shine in diamonds. She sold almost everything. She kept only her wedding ring and some simple earrings that her mother had given her. The rest went to a luxury jewelry store that offered her $305,000. When Vanessa signed the check and saw all that money turned into numbers in a bank account destined for the project, she felt something strange. Freedom. She presented the complete plan to James one afternoon in May, in the same study where everything had begun. Organized folders, detailed budgets, preliminary agreements with companies, everything meticulously prepared. James read every page in silence. When he finished, he looked up. "This is impressive." "I did it alone." Vanessa said in a low voice. Without your money. Without help. I sold the jewels and... I know. James smiled for the first time in months. Sarah told me you have been at the shelter almost every day, that Carmen appreciates you, that Lucy asks for you. Vanessa felt tears in her eyes. Were you watching me? No, I was waiting. James stood up and walked toward her, waiting to see if you would really change or if you were only pretending. And you did it. You changed for real. Vanessa broke into tears, a deep, liberating cry of someone who finally realizes who she had been and who she could become. James hugged her, and in that hug there was forgiveness, but also something else, renewed respect. James decided to do one last test. Without telling anyone, he returned to the shelter disguised again, not with the same level of detail as the first time, but enough to go unnoticed among the residents. It was a Saturday afternoon. The shelter was full of activity, children playing in the yard, adults in training workshops, volunteers moving from one place to another. James sat on a bench in the yard and observed. He saw Vanessa in the kitchen, with her hair in a simple bun without makeup, washing huge pots next to Carmen. The two talked and laughed like old friends. There was no condescension in Vanessa, no that distance she used to put between her and common people. There was genuine camaraderie. He saw Madison in the living room, sitting on the floor surrounded by children. She was reading with different voices for each character, making the little ones laugh. Nora was at her side, her head resting on Madison's shoulder, completely absorbed in the story. When the chapter ended, Madison hugged each child before they left, with true affection. And he saw Arthur in the backyard fixing a wooden fence that had broken. He was sweaty, with hands dirty from paint, working next to Ray. The two talked while they worked, and Arthur listened with attention when Ray told him about his job search. Then Arthur offered him contacts from his sales job, numbers of people who perhaps could help. James stayed there sitting for more than an hour, observing. And what he saw was not performance, it was not an act to please him. It was real transformation. When he stood up to leave, he almost bumped into Sarah. James, she smiled. I knew you would come. How? I recognized you as soon as you entered. Sarah pointed to his face. But they didn't, because they are not looking for you. They are here because they want to be. Have they really changed? Sarah considered the question seriously. Vanessa comes 5 days a week, sometimes 6. She stays until late helping with whatever is needed. Madison organized not only the library, but also a tutoring program where students from her school come to help with homework. Arthur? Sarah smiled. Arthur fixes everything that breaks. And last week he gave me an envelope with $2,000, part of his debt to you, he said. Money earned honestly. James felt something loosen in his chest. I am not saying they are perfect, Sarah continued. They still complain sometimes, they still have moments of frustration, but they are learning, they are growing, and that, James, that is all you can ask of someone. James nodded, unable to speak. That night, back in the mansion that now felt strangely empty, James took out the divorce papers that had been kept in his desk for months. He looked at them for a long time. Then, slowly, he tore them up. Arthur arrived at James's office one Wednesday in June, 6 months after that terrible day in the boardroom. He carried a worn briefcase and an expression that mixed pride and nervousness. Do you have time? He asked from the door. James looked up from his computer. For you, always. Arthur entered and put the briefcase on the table. He opened it with trembling hands and started taking out documents. Bank transfer receipts, sales proofs, payment records. It's not the $240,000, he began. $120,000 are still missing, but these, he pointed to the papers, these $120,000 I earned them, selling insurance, working weekends, selling everything I could. James reviewed the documents in silence. Each receipt was in order, each proof authentic. And the rest? I have a plan. Arthur took out a sheet with calculations. With my current commissions and assuming I keep growing as a salesman, I can pay you $3,000 a month. In 4 years it will all be settled, with interest if you want. I don't want interest, but I want to pay it. Arthur looked at him directly. Because this is not just a debt of money, James. It is a debt of dignity, and I want to settle it completely. James leaned back in his chair, studying his brother. Arthur had lost weight. He looked tired, but he also looked different. There was something in his eyes that had not been there before. Determination. Why now? James asked. Why after 20 years did you decide to finally work for real? Arthur did not answer immediately. He sat on the other side of the desk and looked out the window. Because I saw myself in a mirror that I didn't like. His voice was hoarse. That night, when I saw the video, I saw myself being cruel to someone I thought was worth nothing. And I realized that I also was worth nothing. Everything I had you had given me. Everything I was depended on you. I was no one. You are my brother. No. I was your burden. Arthur looked at him with bright eyes. But I don't want to be anymore. I want to be your real brother. Someone you can feel proud of. James felt a knot in his throat. I already am. The two brothers hugged, a hug that carried years of pain, of silent resentment, of complicated love. But it also carried hope. When Arthur left, James stayed looking at the documents on the table. $120,000 earned honestly. It was not much in terms of his fortune, but it was worth more than any amount, because it represented something that money could not buy, true transformation. The official launch of the Dignity Project was in September, in a modest event hall downtown. Vanessa had insisted that it not be ostentatious, that the money be invested in the program and not in empty celebrations. There were about 80 people, social workers, businessmen who had signed agreements to hire graduates of the program, local journalists, and in the first rows, the first beneficiaries. Carmen was there, in a simple but dignified dress. Ray, who had just gotten a job as a maintenance technician thanks to the program. Lucy, whose baby slept in her arms while she took notes on the accounting courses she would start next week. Vanessa went up to the small stage. James observed her from aside, noticing how she trembled a little but stood firm. I am not going to give a long speech, Vanessa began. I just want to tell you why this project exists. She paused, looking directly at Carmen. 6 months ago, I was a different person. I was not bad, not intentionally, but I was blind. Blind to the struggles of others, blind to my own superficiality, blind to what really matters in life. Her voice broke slightly. And then someone forced me to open my eyes. He put me in a place where I could not hide behind my privilege, where I had to see, listen, and feel. Vanessa explained the program. 6 months of intensive training in high-demand trades, psychological support, resume preparation, internships in real companies, and post-employment follow-up. All free, all designed to give not just a job, but a career. This program exists because I met extraordinary people who only needed a chance. Carmen, who worked 45 years and deserves to live with dignity. Ray, who sacrificed everything for his mother and deserves to rebuild his life. Lucy, who only wants a future for her son. Vanessa had tears in her eyes now. They taught me more than I will ever teach them. The room exploded in applause. Carmen stood up, and soon everyone followed her. After the event, Vanessa found James in the parking lot. What did you think? James took her by the hands. I am proud of you. Not of the project, although it is wonderful. I am proud of the person you have become. Vanessa smiled, with tears rolling down her cheeks. I almost lost everything for being arrogant. I almost lost you. But you didn't. James hugged her. Because when you had the chance to change, you took it. That requires more courage than anything. That night, in the mansion that now felt less empty, James and Vanessa dined together for the first time in months. They did not talk about business or obligations. They talked about renewed dreams, about purposes, about what it meant to build something that mattered beyond money. And for the first time in years, James felt he was dining with the woman he had fallen in love with. Madison turned 15 in December, and for her party, she did not ask for a trip to Paris or expensive jewelry. She asked that the celebration be in the St. Vincent shelter with the children she had learned to love. The request surprised Vanessa, although she should no longer be surprised by anything her daughter did. Madison had changed so much in those months that sometimes she seemed like another person. Or perhaps, Vanessa thought, she was the person she always should have been if they had not raised her in a bubble of privilege and frivolity. James and Vanessa organized a special afternoon with help from Sarah. They decorated the shelter dining room with soft-colored balloons, nothing ostentatious, nothing exaggerated, and prepared a long table with cake for everyone, homemade snacks and fresh fruits. Vanessa herself had baked the chocolate cake, something she had never done in her life until Carmen taught her months ago. The children arrived with cries of joy when they saw the decoration. Nora was the first to hug Madison, followed by an avalanche of small, excited bodies. Madison knelt to be at their height, hugging each one, remembering their names, asking about their weeks. "Did you bring more books?" Nora asked with bright eyes. "Better than that." Madison pointed to a side table where there were wrapped individual gifts for each child. "Each one has their own gift today." The afternoon passed with games in the yard, songs and laughter that filled every corner of the shelter. James observed from a side with Arthur at his side. His younger brother had arrived early to help with the decoration and now held a glass of lemonade, smiling genuinely while watching the children play. "Do you remember my 15th birthday?" Arthur asked suddenly. James looked at him from the corner of his eye. "I remember it. A party in an event hall, 200 guests, professional DJ. And I felt empty all night." Arthur shook his head. "Surrounded by people who were only there for the free food and appearances. Look at Madison now." The two observed how Madison organized a potato sack race with the smallest children, laughing as loud as them, with messy hair and red cheeks from joy. "She is happy for real," Arthur continued, "because this is real. These people love her for who she is, not for what she has." "Just like you," James said, putting a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Sarah told me that the residents ask for you when you don't come, that they trust you." Arthur swallowed, emotional. "It's the first thing in my life that I feel I earned by my own merit." When the time for the cake came, Nora insisted that everyone sing, and her high-pitched voice led the out-of-tune but enthusiastic choir. Madison blew out the candles with her eyes closed, and when someone asked her what she had asked for, she responded, "I ask that all the children here find happy homes soon." The dining room stayed in silence for a moment. Then Carmen, who was helping to serve the cake portions, approached and kissed Madison's forehead. "You are a good girl," she whispered to her. "Your parents should be proud." Vanessa, who listened from nearby, felt tears burning her eyes. She approached Carmen and hugged her without saying anything, because there were no words enough to express the gratitude she felt toward that woman who had been patient with her, who had guided her without judging her, who had taught her what true dignity meant. After distributing the cake, the time for gifts came. Each child received something chosen specifically for them. Nora got a complete collection of adventure books and a personalized bookmark with her name. A boy named Jack received an art set because Madison had noticed he always drew in the margins of notebooks. A little girl named Lily received a handmade rag doll that Carmen had sewn specially, but the best gift was not for any child in particular. James stood up when the gifts finished and asked for attention with a clap. "There is something more we want to share today." He looked at Sarah, who was at the back of the dining room with her arms crossed, smiling. "Sarah, can you come?" The director approached with curiosity. James gave her a large envelope. "What is this?" "Open it." Sarah took out the documents and read them in silence. Her eyes grew progressively larger. "James, this is $500,000. To renovate the facilities," James explained. "New dormitories, enlarged kitchen, modern heating system and space to double the capacity of residents." Sarah put a hand to her mouth with tears rolling down her cheeks. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Vanessa intervened. "Say you are going to use them to help more people like Carmen, like Ray, like Lucy." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The residents present exploded in applause. Carmen hugged Vanessa with so much force she almost knocked her over. Anthony, the older man who had lost his wife, wiped his eyes discreetly. And Ray, who now worked as a maintenance technician in a construction company, shook James's hand with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for believing that we deserved a chance," Ray said. "Not only with money, but with time, with attention, with humanity." When the party ended and the sun was starting to set, painting the sky with oranges and pinks, the Miller family stayed helping to clean. Madison washed dishes next to Nora, teaching her how to make foam with the soap. Arthur collected chairs with Anthony, listening to stories of what the city was like 40 years ago. Vanessa and Carmen ordered the leftover gifts in the warehouse, talking about the accounting course that Carmen would start soon thanks to the Dignity Project. And James, standing in the dining room door, observed them all with a sensation of fullness he had not experienced in years. This was his family. Not perfect, but real. Not immaculate, but honest. Not without scars, but healing. That night when Madison was saying goodbye to Nora at the shelter door, the little girl hugged her tight and whispered, "You are my best friend." Madison felt her heart expand until it almost hurt. "And you are mine." Back in the car, Madison approached her father in the back seat. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Anything, honey." "I want to keep coming here. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Saturdays are my favorite day of the week now." She paused. "And when I'm older, I want to study social work. I want to help people like Nora, like Carmen, like all of them." James hugged his daughter, feeling a mixture of pride and relief that tightened his chest. The girl who had closed the curtain no longer existed. In her place was a young woman with empathy, with purpose, with deep understanding that privilege comes with responsibility. "You will be wonderful at that," he whispered to her, "because you have something that cannot be taught in any university, a heart that really feels." Arthur appeared with his last monthly payment just before Christmas. This time he did not come alone to James's office, but he brought something more than money. He arrived with a portfolio under his arm and an expression that mixed nervousness and hope. $160,000 returned so far, Arthur said, placing the check on the desk. 8 more months and I will be completely free of the debt. James took the check, but did not stop looking at his brother. "And what is that?" He pointed to the portfolio. Arthur opened it and took out several papers, certificates, recommendation letters, a Salesman of the Month recognition from his company. "I wanted to show you that I am not only paying the debt, I am building something." His voice trembled slightly. "I was promoted to regional manager. I'm going to lead a team of 10 salesmen, and this," he took out a last letter, "is from Ray. I got them to hire him in my company as a maintenance technician. He himself wrote this to thank me." James read the letter written by hand with careful calligraphy. Ray thanked Arthur for the opportunity, for believing in him when no one else did, for teaching him that hard work is rewarded. "Arthur," James looked up with wet eyes, "this is more valuable than any check." "I know." Arthur sat down. "That's why I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to know that when you gave me that chance to change, I didn't waste it. And now I'm trying to give chances to others, as you did with me." The two brothers stayed in silence for a moment. "Do you know what is the strangest thing?" Arthur said finally. "Before I hated working. Every day was a torture because I didn't see the point. But now I get up wanting to go to the office, because I know that what I earn is mine. Because I know I'm helping my team to grow. Because I have a purpose. You were always capable of this," James said. "You just needed to remember it, or perhaps you needed to discover it for the first time." Arthur smiled. "I will keep coming to the shelter on Sundays. I like fixing things. It makes me feel useful. And besides," his smile widened, "Anthony is teaching me to play chess. He is surprisingly good." When Arthur left, James kept the certificates in a special drawer of his desk next to the payment proofs, not for the monetary value, but because they represented something that no amount of money could buy, the transformation of a man who had found his dignity. On Christmas Eve, the Miller family dined together in the mansion for the first time in months. But before starting, Vanessa proposed something different. "What if this year we deliver the gifts in the shelter first? We can dine afterward." Everyone agreed immediately. They spent Christmas Eve afternoon serving dinner to 120 people, more than ever because word was already spreading that St. Vincent was a place where everyone was treated with dignity. They distributed gifts to children and adults, sharing stories with residents who had become true friends. James noticed how Vanessa moved through the dining room with the natural grace of someone who belonged there, greeting each person by their name, remembering details of their lives, asking about their progress. This was the woman he had fallen in love with so many years ago, the one who had been buried under layers of materialism and superficiality. Daniel, James's oldest son, was also there with his girlfriend Claire, both serving food and organizing games for the children. Seeing his two families, the old one and the new one, united in this common purpose filled James with a joy that no successful business had ever given him. When they returned home near midnight, with the smell of pine from the shelter dining room still on their clothes, James gathered them all in the main living room. The lights of the Christmas tree shone softly, creating warm shadows on the walls. "There is something I want to tell you," James began, with his voice loaded with emotion. "And I want Madison to also be present for this, because she is part of this family as much as anyone." He took out the divorce papers, already torn for a long time, but that he had kept as a reminder. He showed them to the light. 6 months ago, I was going to end all of this. I was going to destroy this family because I thought it was rotten from the inside. I thought love had turned into a transaction, that the connection had been reduced to money, that there was no more hope. Vanessa put a hand to her chest, with tears starting to form. "But you—" James looked at each one. "Proved to me something I didn't expect, something I didn't even know I was looking for. You proved to me that people can change if they really want to. That redemption is not only possible, it is beautiful. That true love survives even when it seems dead." Arthur had his head down, fighting tears. "You taught me that giving a second chance is not weakness, but the greatest strength. That forgiving does not mean forgetting, but choosing to believe in the future more than in the past." James's voice broke. "So I'm not going to sign any divorce. I'm not going to cut any tie. We are going to rebuild this family on new bases of respect, of empathy, of honest work, and of true love. The love that is earned every day with actions, not just with words." Madison was the first to move, hugging her father with so much force she almost knocked him over. Then Vanessa joined, followed by Arthur. The four stayed hugged in the middle of the room, crying together, laughing together, healing together the wounds they had created, and that now, finally, they could start to close for real. When they separated, Daniel approached with Claire and also hugged his father. "This is what Mom would have wanted," Daniel whispered, referring to his biological mother, "that you would not judge without giving the chance to change." Vanessa, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable months ago, hugged Daniel. "Thank you for being patient with us, for not judging us when you had every reason to be judged." That night, for the first time in years, the Miller family felt complete. 1 year after that terrible night in front of the gate, James organized a special dinner that he had been planning for weeks with care. Not in a luxury restaurant where prices were obscene and food more presentation than substance. Not in the mansion where the shadows of the past still whispered sometimes, but in the St. Vincent shelter dining room after normal hours, when the place fell into silence and the stories could be told without hurry. He invited Carmen, who now lived in a social protection apartment and worked part-time as a sewing instructor in the Dignity Project, teaching other women the trade she had mastered for decades. He invited Ray, who not only had stable employment but was saving to rent his own apartment. He invited Lucy with her son David, who was now 2 years old and ran everywhere with the infinite energy of small children. Lucy had completed her accounting course and worked in a small company, rebuilding her life step by step. He also invited Anthony, who had found permanent housing and spent his days playing chess with other older residents in the park. Nora and her mother, who finally had gotten an apartment and stability. Sarah, of course, the woman who had been the anchor of all this place. Daniel and Claire, who had just announced their engagement, Frank the lawyer, who had seen all the transformation from his privileged position of legal advisor and friend. The table was long and simple, put together with wooden planks that Arthur had built specifically for this occasion. It was decorated with flowers from the shelter garden, nothing expensive, just simple beauty, and candles that cast warm light on the faces gathered. The food was prepared by Vanessa and Carmen together, a menu that combined traditional dishes with recipes they had learned from each other in these months of collaboration. There was beef stew, fresh salads, homemade bread that Carmen had taught how to make, and for dessert, Vanessa's famous chocolate cake that was already legendary in the shelter. When everyone was seated with full plates and conversations flowing naturally, James stood up. The dining room went gradually silent until all eyes turned toward him. He had a glass of water in his hand, never wine because some at the table fought with addictions and James wanted everyone to feel comfortable, and he raised it slowly. "I want to make a toast," he began, his voice a little trembling with emotion, "to second chances, to the courage to admit you were wrong and the strength to change, and to the extraordinary people who teach us day after day that true wealth is not measured in banks but in hearts." Everyone raised their glasses, some with water, others with juice, but all with the same intention. "1 year ago," James continued, "I stood in front of the gate of my own house dressed as a beggar, looking for an answer to a question that terrified me. Do they love me for who I am or for what I have? And the answer I received." He paused, looking at Vanessa, Arthur, Madison. "The answer destroyed me." Vanessa looked down with tears already running down her cheeks. Arthur clenched his fists on the table. But that destruction was necessary, because sometimes things have to break completely before they can be rebuilt better. James looked around the table, and what I found in this place with all these people was something I had lost in my own house: genuine humanity. Carmen stood up then, with her 73 years but with the dignity of a queen. "Allow me to add something, James." Her voice was firm and clear. "You gave us opportunities, work, training, hope, but we gave you something too. We gave you back your family, and I think that makes us even." Ray raised his glass. "I only want to say that when I arrived here a year ago, I had lost everything. My dignity, my hope, my faith that things could improve." He looked at Arthur. "And this man, who could have ignored me like anyone else, gave me a chance. Not because it suited him, but because he finally understood what it means to have empathy." Arthur wiped his eyes, emotional. Lucy spoke next, with David asleep in her lap. "I was a single mother, without resources, without family to support me. And Vanessa." She looked at the woman who a year ago would have despised her without even knowing her. "Vanessa taught me that it's never too late to change, that admitting you were wrong is more courageous than pretending you were always right." Vanessa stood up, wiping her tears. "Lucy, you taught me what it means to be truly strong. Raising a son alone, working, studying, never giving up." Her voice broke. "I had everything, and I felt empty. You had nothing, and even so, you had dignity, purpose, love. It was I who learned from you." Anthony, the older man who had lost his wife, raised his trembling glass. "To those who are no longer here but taught us to be better. To Rose, James's mother, who instilled in him values that saved this family. To my Elena, who would have scolded me for having given up for a while. And to all those who have passed through this shelter and have left a mark." The glasses clinked softly, creating a crystalline sound that echoed in the emotional silence of the dining room. After the toast, Madison asked permission to speak. She stood up, with her 15 years, but with a maturity that went beyond her age. "I was a selfish girl," she began with her voice clear. "I closed a curtain when I should have opened a door. I looked away when I should have reached out my hand." She looked at Nora, who was sitting next to her. "But people like Nora taught me that the most important dreams are not the ones that cost money. They are the ones that cost heart." Nora, now 11 years old, and with a confidence she didn't have a year ago, stood up too. "Madison is my best friend, and thanks to her and her family, now I have my own library at home, books I can read whenever I want." she smiled. "But more important, I have people who believe in me, who tell me I can be whatever I want to be." The dinner continued with stories, with laughter, with occasional tears of joy. Frank, the lawyer, told how he had seen James build his empire, but that this, pointing to the table full of diverse people united by mutual respect, was his greatest achievement. Daniel talked about how his father had taught him that true leadership was not commanding but serving. When the night advanced and the dessert was served, Sarah stood up with an announcement. Thanks to the donation of the Miller family and the tireless work of volunteers like Arthur, Vanessa, and Madison, this shelter is going to double its capacity next year. Her eyes shone. We are going to be able to help 200 people simultaneously, 200 stories of hope. Applause filled the dining room. But there is something more, Sarah continued. The Dignity Project has already helped 35 people to find stable employment, 35 families rebuilding their lives, and this is only the beginning. Vanessa added, "Next month we open a second headquarters of the project in Chicago, and we are in talks for a third in Miami." She looked at James. "Because a person taught me that real change doesn't come from regretting the past, but from building a better future." Tears were inevitable now. Carmen hugged Vanessa. Anthony shook James's hand for a long time, without being able to speak. Ray and Arthur gave each other a brotherly hug, united by their shared transformation. When the dinner ended, and the goodbyes were said one by one, with long hugs and promises to return soon, James stayed a moment alone in the shelter. He walked through the empty hallways he now knew so well, remembering. He thought about the man he had been, an invisible beggar at his own door, rejected by those he loved most. He thought about the humiliation, about the pain, about the rage he felt kneeling on that cold street. He thought about the temptation to take revenge, to destroy, to make each one pay. But he also thought about what came next, about the transformation of Vanessa, who went from being superficial to having a deep purpose, about the change in Arthur, who discovered the pride of honest work, about the growth of Madison, who learned that privilege is a responsibility. He thought about his mother, Rose, and what she would have said to him if she had lived to see all this. He could hear her voice in his mind, clear as day. "Money comes and goes, Jim, but what you are inside, no one can take that from you. And what you give from the heart, that comes back multiplied." Finally, he understood the true wisdom of those words. It was not just about preserving kindness in times of poverty. It was about not losing it in times of abundance. It was about remembering that every person, no matter their appearance, their status, their bank account, carries inside the same fundamental dignity that deserves to be recognized and respected. James walked out of the shelter into the cold night. The sky was clear and the stars shone with uncommon clarity in the city. The street still had Christmas lights that flickered softly. The city continued its infinite rhythm, indifferent to the small personal revolutions occurring in individual hearts. And he, James Miller, walked back home, knowing he had won something much more valuable than his $50 million fortune. He had won back his humanity. He had recovered his family, not as it was before, but as it could be, authentic, compassionate, connected to the real world beyond its privileged walls. He knew that the road had not ended, that there would be setbacks, difficult moments, temptations to return to old habits. But now they had a moral compass that would guide them, the memory of what they had learned, of the people they had met, of the pain they had caused, and of the good they now could do. As he walked, James reflected on the true nature of justice. For months he had believed that justice meant punishment, consequences, making the guilty pay for their mistakes. But he had discovered something deeper, more transforming. True justice is not crushing the one who makes a mistake, but offering them the opportunity to learn, to change, to become the best version of themselves. It is having the strength to give second chances, even when they are not deserved. Because sometimes it is precisely in that act of grace where true transformation occurs. And when that opportunity is taken seriously, with humility, with an open heart, change is not only possible, it is inevitable, beautiful, and eternal.